Welcome to Alliance Chat with the Chargers Alliance. My name is Cam Garden, and I am a co-chair for the Chargers Alliance. Today, we'll be chatting with Dr. Patrick McGrady, Associate Professor of the Sociology Department here at the University of New Haven. And the topic today is the power of language. Welcome, Dr. McGrady.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I first would like to talk a little bit about person-first language. It's something that I've personally read a lot about recently. And person-first language is basically taking like descriptive nouns and we've taken a lot of descriptive nouns and made them into adjectives. So instead of referring to someone as a handicapped person, you would refer to them as a person with a disability. What do you think about the push to use person-first language and how that affects the way that we view the people we interact with?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So overall, I support that type of movement. The move to not explicitly labeling people by a quality like that, instead of just that's all they are, that's their master status. I think opens up for a larger interpretation of that person as their character, who they are. And so the example that you gave, person with a disability as opposed to handicap, that allows for the audience, the person who's speaking, to think about the person as more than just, what sort of disability that they're living with, that they are they're much more complex than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think we also see a lot of descriptors. I think that, part of our society and the way that we use language is by classifying people. And so I think another really big topic that we've started to see a debate on is the way that marginalized groups are or are not allowed to reclaim slurs that have been historically used against them. I think the most prolific example would be the reclamation of the N-word in the African-American community. But we've also seen it in the LGBT community. And that's even dissented into arguments about which members of the LGBT community can use which slurs. So I guess my question is, what are your opinions on word reclamation and how it works in our society?
Yeah, that's a big question, but a great question. So I'm gonna kind of meander to an answer, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. So I think about several things, and I think the most important thing I think about is one's social location. Groups in society have the autonomy or the right to reclaim certain terms. We've seen actually in LGBTQ history, the reclamation of certain symbols as a way of sort of like kind of subverting like what that symbol was originally intended to do, which was meant to subordinate the group, but now it's being used as a source of pride. There is, I think, some pros to the reclamation of those terms. What I think that opens up to, though, is these debates about, well, if they can say it, why can't I say it? And so I think about sort of, several things in response to that. And the first is one's social location. As a professor that teaches sociology, I could have a conversation in my classes about this process and these terms. And when I do have those conversations, I make the personal decision to not actually use the terms because, as a white person, I could facilitate an academic discussion about the N-word, and I could have the intent that it's going to be about removing the power from that words can hurt people, but I don't understand fully the impact of my students, particularly students of color in my classes, what that feels like for them to be hearing this term coming out of the mouths of people who perhaps shouldn't be using those terms. So I think about the social location, I think about the intent and versus impact, and that, in some circles, like it is a reclamation, but it could have differential impacts in other locations. You definitely see that in the LGBTQ community with the reclamations of certain slurs in some circles, like those terms are still very harmful to hear, can be triggering, and can link to some pretty terrible experiences. And then I also think about sort of like the role of being reflexive in our process. So reflexivity refers to basically how much we think about our actions and our speech, how much we reflect on those things. And in the moment, interaction's very fast. It's kind of hard to engage in that continual reflexive process, but we can engage in that afterward to think about, was my use of that terminology appropriate? Was the audience appropriate? Did it serve a purpose of reclaiming the term versus like being controversial or what have you? And so that's sort of how I think about sort of like the reclamation of these terms. That, my opinion is any social group in society has the right to reclaim that. I'm certainly not in the business of telling people that they can or cannot say certain terms, but I know at least like in my own spaces and my own conversations, like I choose to err on the side of caution, to err on the side of thinking about the impact that those terms have on certain people, and thinking about sort of like my own location there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really interesting, and I like that you brought up intent, because one of my other questions is because when you're analyzing the power of words and language, there's something to be said about an actual lack of knowledge. Like there are things that people don't know. People make mistakes. We have to learn from those mistakes. So how would you navigate the very delicate balance between someone committing a microaggression and acting in like unconscious bias? Like, do you think there's really a difference between the two? Or does action outweigh intention?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question, right? So again, I think about the reflexive process, because we can make certain statements or jokes or terms to people with the intent that it was just a joke, or this is an academic discussion. But the impact that has on people, I don't have full control of that. And so, so I don't know if they're exactly the same thing. Microaggressions, I think is a kind of as a larger term, because you have sort of like the more like insidious forms that are where the intent is to actually cut down the person versus like the accidental cutting down of someone. But again, for me, it's all about sort of like being reflexive and thinking about, reflecting on past interactions that maybe went wrong, and thinking like, okay, could have I said something different or used different terminology here? And so, yeah, that's sort of where I think about those two things. What was the other part of your question?
Just if action outweighs intention.
If action outweighs intention, I think action outweighs it for sure, because we can plan for the best and hope for the best, but we have no control of how someone's going to interpret that action. But that also kind of means that we're going to make mistakes regardless. We can make every precaution to correct for mistakes. And so I think one thing that we can do, in addition to being reflective, but is also to accept feedback from people. If someone gives you feedback that, hey, maybe don't say that, or like when you have like these, that sort of thought process, that actually kind of reproduces a bias or an inequality in the interaction there. It makes whatever space that you have created as maybe not the most productive for conversation or for coming to a consensus around something. So to accept the feedback and integrate that into your thinking, and then move on, because once it's out there, you can't take it back. And if someone is telling you that what you have said was hurtful or was triggering or what have you, you have to own that, accept the feedback, and do better next time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think just the idea of being open to that conversation is a huge part of navigating these topics. And something really interesting that I've started to notice, given our society and a number of different factors, is recently I've noticed a lot of debate, mostly surrounding word reclamation. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term, but AAVE, or African American Vernacular English. There's been a lot of debate about the use of AAVE in internet scenarios and internet communities, because for a lot of African American people, myself included, it's an actual dialect. It's a language with its own grammatical structure, and it is rooted in English, but it does have its own rules. And you learn to speak the language the same way you would learn to speak English if you grow up around it. But there are people on the other side of the debate who would argue that a lot of the words used in AAVE are really just internet culture or meme culture. So I'm curious what you would say where the line needs to be drawn as far as verbal cultural appropriation.
So when you say verbal cultural appropriation, like you mean people that would maybe fall outside of the African American community using the terms?
Right.
Oh, yeah. For me, it's. I think I would say two things about this. Maybe one kind of at a bigger macro picture, and one at the smaller level here. I would think about the intent as to why that person who maybe is not directly related to that community wants to use this language. Is it to identify with someone? Is it to claim some sort of status in that space? And you have like this interesting kind of power dynamic going on. And to that point, is it being appreciative of that particular culture, or are you just using it to kind of to get ahead, or to get something that you want? But I also will say that this all exists in a bigger kind of structure that inherently devalues this type of speech pattern. And so I think we also have to have a larger conversation about why is it that we value one kind of brand of English over another. And what does that say sort of about the nature of systemic racial inequality as it kind of seeps down to language? Because I think about, in places like schools and whatnot, we tend to value different speech patterns over others, or different writing patterns over others. And so if I'm a professor that's going to be reading a paper that's just as good, but uses different terminology that's different from my own culture, that's a problem if I'm going to grade that paper more harshly. And so I think we also, with the appropriation sort of question, we also would want to think about, like, this all exists in a larger power structure that privileges or values, other forms of speech patterns relative to the AAVE. If that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. I'll be interested to see, if there's any research done on this. I think it's not an entirely new phenomenon, but just especially with the pandemic and people spending a lot more time on the internet, I think we're starting to see a rise in these conversations, which is going to open up a lot of doors for research and honestly just being able to have these kind of conversations.
For sure.
Yeah. So another thing that I've noticed is how we kind of talk about political correctness in our society. And when I first heard the term, I was all for it, and I thought it was really important. But the more that I've begun to think about it, is it really political correctness, or is it an issue of whether or not we are treating people with respect? I think we see a lot of rhetoric about, oh, that's not politically correct. So I guess to put in a question, is there really a space for the phrase politically correct, or do we need to just start respecting people's identities?
Yeah, I mean, I have the belief that it kind of goes back to that thing about sort of the intent, the impact that certain things have, right? Political correctness has become one of those terms that has all these connotations to it. I think probably if you ask someone to close their eyes and like imagine someone that's going to be politically correct, and how they apply it, there's a certain typology of a person emerges in that thinking. I think there is, I think I'm probably of two minds of this. I think we should always center the respect of individuals when talking about, things like race or gender or sexual identity or anything really, and making sure that we're not like, having a conversation or doing something at the expense of their humanity. At the same time, I also see the value in spaces where we're able to maybe still have a culture of respect, but we explore, in carefully guided conversations or spaces about why certain terms or language or processes have such a power over individuals. And some of that might involve sort of like deviating from the norms of respectability politics or from like civic engagement. Mm-hmm. And so, but while I would still believe we would still want to center like protecting the humanity of individuals. So it's kind of a mixed bag for me that I don't, the term politically correct is so charged these days. It's just not, it's kind of like the whole cancel culture term. It's gone, it's been redefined so much that now it's like, does it have a meaning to it? Or is it just, like, as you say, I like how you put it, that maybe we should just respect people and meet them where they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then, stemming from that, we've seen a lot of people talking about preferred pronouns and whether or not you should put your pronouns in your bio or at the end of your email signature. Even now with Zoom, if you should put your pronouns next to your name on Zoom. So I'm curious if you think there will ever be a point in time where we're able to move away from this concept of preferred pronouns and, same thing as political correctness, kind of understand that these aren't really, it's not a preference, it's people's identities.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have been seeing some move away from that, right? I'm seeing, at least at the university, folks in position of power use just the term, these are my pronouns. They drop the preference or the preferred thing. The idea of putting pronouns like in an email signature or on your Zoom, you can also put it in Canvas too now,
right?
Which is pretty cool. It's about normalizing, but it's also about protecting people who maybe are not sure or they're not ready to disclose. So, when at start of every semester, we always, when we do these introductions, this is my name in the classroom, this is my major, things like that. The question is like, do you ask people their pronouns? And so there's sort of kind of two lines of thinking that I've observed amongst teachers, is that, well, on one hand is that, yes, you should ask for them. It's about respecting and normalizing, and I completely get that. But then there's the other kind of part too, like where maybe someone is not ready to disclose that. And, if you're forcing them to share pronouns, like, are you outing them in some way that maybe they're not ready? And so I think the idea behind all of this, is to, as you say, get to a place where it's not as big of a deal anymore, that, and that's why I think it is important that cisgender individuals are doing that work, because it signals that the space is good for trans or non-binary individuals, and it also kind of helps like with dispelling that myth or that notion that if you're someone who shares your pronouns, then you're automatically trans or non-binary. So it's like a normalization sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. It's been really interesting just to see these conversations come up, and I think yesterday or 2 days ago, I was reading something about but getting rid of the idea of people who identify as, just because they don't, like, that's just who they are. So I think it's really interesting to see how we develop these speech patterns, and more or less how we start to accept people into our culture, and just, like you said, normalize a lot more things. So it's not really as easy to single out individuals.
Yeah, yeah, I like that sort of like, you know, I like how you put it, like, you know, removing the identify as, like, this is just my pronouns
Mm-hmm.
are this, you know. I think that I think removes an unnecessarily complicated layer to it.
Right. So lastly, I feel like we need to talk about this because of the recent shooting in Atlanta. 6 Asian women were murdered in a hate crime perpetrated by a white man. And it's impossible to ignore the historical context of the situation, that is the very violent and racist rhetoric that has surrounded the COVID-19 pandemic and its reported origins in China.
Yeah.
So, what would you say about the intense power that rhetoric has and how we use our words?
I'd say it has a tremendous power. You know, of course, like, you know, you're going to have people who are going to argue that this has nothing to do with race, that it was just a coincidence or what have you. But you can't ignore the context. We had a former president that would openly talk about this in pretty negative terms, linking it to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. That when you have that much social power, that gets circulated amongst people, and that rhetoric kind of trickles down to how we think about, you know, how we think about people at an individual level. To say that a rhetoric causes the bad behavior, I don't buy that, right? But I do say that the rhetoric and the culture that it creates makes it easier for those crimes to occur. It's sort of like when we think about why we want to, in general, try to move people away from being, you know, not just moving them away from acting racist, but moving them away from thinking like a racist, because you can act great all this time, but if you're in these situations, if you have like this racist thinking, it makes it easier to act in a racist way. So the idea, you know, is it's not so much to say that rhetoric causes this horrific thing, and in a broader context has caused the spike in hate crimes committed against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States this past year, but it does make it easier for people to engage in that behavior, especially when that type of rhetoric is promoted at what we consider legitimate levels, like amongst politicians or amongst people who hold significant social power. So yeah, I mean, I think you can't ignore that the rhetoric plays a part here. Is it the only factor? No, but it certainly is a factor that probably makes, you know, acting in a racist manner a little bit easier for the individual, because it's kind of, you know, it's how they're thinking.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think there needs to be more emphasis on removing the ideology versus just correcting the behavior. Because I think if you remain in the ideology, you can correct behavior all you want, and it's just going to keep repeating itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like, you know, this is, I mean, I'm not a social psychologist, but the social psychologists keep telling me that you know, we have like these the way we kind of think about, you know, values in the world. We have like these sort of baseline beliefs, like these fundamental beliefs, and if that baseline is racist or sexist or what have you in origin, until you change that, like you can't, well, I should put it this way: until you change that sort of that primitive belief, if you put people in like these sort of pressure situations, this sort of fight or flight thing, we kind of go back to that sort of baseline primitive belief, and can cause pretty horrific events there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree with you too. It's sort of the, you know, it's not just about the behavior. It's all, and but it's also about changing belief, and part of that is changing rhetoric. But yeah.
So those are all of my questions. Do you have any final thoughts or comments that I wasn't able to address?
No, I think you got through my notes here. I wrote down some stuff here, but I think maybe one thing I'd like to maybe say, and maybe you have some thoughts about this, is the power that's attached to language. The topic is power of words and power of language. I'm going to throw out a term here that sociologists love to use, but the power that's associated with language and terms is a socially constructed power, and that means that if it's socially constructed, we as a society or as a collective have the power to change that definition. It's not an overnight quick thing, but it is something that we do have the power to do. At the same time, we could call it a socially constructed power, but it is very real in its consequences. We could believe that the N-word or epithets that are thrown towards the LGBT community don't have real power. It's just socially constructed power, but that impact has real consequences on the individual who's the target of those terms. And so I would like to, maybe highlight that, that while this power is, socially constructed or negotiated, it is very real in its consequences. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes. That makes so much sense. I agree. I agree with you that there's definitely we have a responsibility as a society to start deconstructing some of these systems that we've become accustomed to. But at the same time, I think it's also really important to understand and maybe even research just the historical context, because sometimes it's not as simple as just, everyone coming together and saying, hey, we don't believe in this anymore. We have to dig deep and understand why it was an issue to begin with before we can begin that deconstruction process.
Agreed, and doing it very carefully and doing it very well, because we have a long history here with this terminology that's used in popular culture and in writings that we think as foundational to our society or parts of society, and we have to treat that like the discussion with care. That we can't just come together and say, okay, this term is no longer, we're not going to use it anymore. It's like, let's talk about why this is problematic and why this is causing harm, and what are the ways of sort of rectifying that harm, and what are things that we can do to make sure that the impact that we're giving is not a harmful one.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and sharing your thoughts on the power of language and words in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We wish you the best of luck for the rest of the spring semester.
Well, thanks for having me. This was fun, and I also wish you all a lot of luck. We are almost just 1 month left in the semester, so we are making it. We're gonna pull through.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.